This is the word of the Lord, and thanks be to God. All right. Oop, what's going on here? Yep. So, I don't know if any of you have ever watched a rather popular television show called The X-Files. I have. It was one of my favorites. I binge watched it about 7 or 8 years ago. And I actually have a sweater that I was knitting at the time where one sleeve is longer than the other because I wasn't paying attention. And I knitted a sleeve, an extra 3 inches on a sleeve because I was so into the show. Anyway, that's just me being me. But one of the reasons that the X-Files was so very popular when it came out in the early 90s was it was a dark and atmospheric show. And you know, Mulder and Scully would walk into rooms and it was so dark, and it lit up your imagination. Ooh, what could possibly pop out at them? And when we watch it now, David is like, can't they turn on a light? Well, the thing is, and as the show began, it was on a very limited budget, and they didn't have the money to be able to light the sets. So what they did was they would just send David Duchovny and Gillian Anderson into the room with flashlights. That was their lighting for that particular scene. So it was an economic necessity made the show dark and atmospheric. It's really kind of a funny thing about that hit show, but it's also kind of a fact of what light does. And if you have ever been to see like a backstage, that's part of one of the things that's so impressive about plays is how a stage is lit. But when the show is over and all the lights are off on stage and all the lights are up in the house and the work lights are on backstage, you see everything. You see that this gorgeous dining room that was on stage is just it's canvas. It's a painting. It's an illusion. So light can frequently or the lack thereof can really set a stage, set a theme. One of my favorite songs by Dolly Parton is a song called Light of a Clear Blue Morning. And it's a song that she wrote about seeing life differently after leaving her longtime partnership with Porter Wagoner. She had gone to, she had gone to see him. The story that she tells is that she had written this song called I Will Always Love You. And he agreed to severing their professional relationship if he could produce that song. And so she agreed to that, and she was driving home to her home in Tennessee, and it was dark, but and she had, I guess she had a long way to go, or it was really late, because she said as she was pulling into her community, the sun rose and the sky turned blue, and this song came to her, Light of a Clear Blue Morning, just as a whole, and she ran into the house and wrote it. I would recommend, if you have the chance, to find that song and listen to it. It's truly, truly remarkable. So today, and Jesus is talking about Jesus followers being salt and being light. He also talks about himself coming to not to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. That's the second lesson from the sermon today. And as we saw last week, Jesus' audience for this particular sermon is made up of specifically his disciples. He took his core group up onto the hill, but when people saw him moving, they probably followed after him because he had been fulfilling part of the mission of God by healing all the people that had been brought to him. So this first move of Jesus is to present all of these people who are around him with a surprising and encouraging map of God's blessings. So Jesus has just prior to this passage today, has proclaimed the surprising news that many of the people listening to him are actually among those who have been graciously blessed by God. And now Jesus makes this idea even more explicit. He addresses his audience directly using the second person, all y'all, or as the people in my husband's part of the world in Western Pennsylvania would say, yins. Yins are the salt of the earth. Yins are the light of the world. You, all y'all, are salt. You are the light of the world. God has made you, God has blessed you for a particular role in creation's redemption. Again, Jesus is using things in creation, things that we pretty much take for granted, to teach how a little bit of something can make a big difference for the entirety. Like salt, we can spice things up, bringing out flavors in a dish. And like light, we can illuminate a room, dispel shadows, or guide the lost traveler home. So we're going to look at salt and light first. And some of the things that I have read and have talked about before in preaching this particular passage in years past is that salt had a specific purpose in that culture and that time. Like our time, it flavors. Salt also is used to purify, and it preserved food. Now, if salt loses any of those particular characteristics, it no longer has any function. There is an activeness to salt and its use in our lives. And there's an activeness and use to us as being salt. We don't just sit there. Salt's value comes in its application and its use with other things. So likewise, we as followers of Jesus are called to exist connected to others. But Jesus warns in saying that you are the salt of the earth, that salt can literally become, quote, foolish. The Greek word there is moraine, which is the root word for fool. Salt can become foolish if it loses its taste, if it loses its value. And there's nothing you can do to change that. It's just tossed out. And another thing about salt, if there's too much of it, that can really ruin the flavor of a dish. We learned that one time when we used a 1/4 cup of salt in a recipe instead of a 1/4 teaspoon. Even our dog wouldn't eat what we made. No way, even the dog wouldn't eat that one. So that's salt. Now, light illuminates, light guides, light can even protect, which is part of what I think most people were yelling at Scully and Mulder to do in the X-Files. Turn on a light, protect yourself. We don't turn on lights unless we're going to use them. And even when we decorate with light, think of like the lights at Christmas, we use that to elicit feelings. When we put up the Christmas lights, when we light the candles, we can be guiding people to our home. Look for these particular lights, as that's where the Christmas party will be. But it's also eliciting a feeling of warmth and of comfort. When Jesus uses this idea of us being light, it's not simply to allow others to see whatever they want, but for others to witness the acts of justice that we perform. Let your good deeds be shown among the people. We are called to be like these very common and somewhat peculiar elements in the world. We are just called to be distinct, and that's what makes us salt and light. Now, sometimes this kind of gets translated into a numbers issue, but it's not. Salt and light are everywhere. If you're looking at me if you are clued into the video of Zoom or you're watching on Facebook, you see behind me that there is I have a background of stars in the sky. It's impossible to count how many stars there are. And if you look at a salt shaker, it's impossible to count the grains of sand. I mean, you could, but why would you? There's just so much. But for us being salt and light, it's not about numbers, it's about quality. And our saltiness and our being light is to be so integral to us that we exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. I'll get to that in a little bit. Because now I want to look at what Jesus meant when he talked about not abolishing, but fulfilling the law. So the question is, how do we act as salt and light? By following Jesus and Jesus' example as he fulfills the law. In the Gospels, if we read them very carefully, if we read them with a particular perspective of the folks of who have something to lose with Jesus, he is frequently described by other people, particularly the people who have something to lose, as a renegade, a rebel, a turncoat, someone who is betraying the people. And that is really eventually what got him into so much trouble with the powers that be. They couldn't understand that what he was doing was not picking away at the law, but fulfilling it. Because for them, the Jewish identity in a Roman world was paramount. And if he comes along and he starts pulling anything off of that identity, then he's destroying that identity and he must be eliminated. In this sermon, Jesus disputes that claim about him. I haven't come to abolish it, he says. And abolish means eradicate, eliminate, end, tear apart, loosen, throw out. Jesus says, nope, that's not what I'm here to do. I am here to take what God gave us through Moses and fulfill it, complete it, fill it to capacity. It's like taking a balloon and blowing it up and not sending it over another country. Sorry, I had to say that. In doing this, in fulfilling Moses' law, by showing the people that, yes, this is what is on the books, this is how you live it out. That exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, because the scribes and the Pharisees are sticking to the written letter. What's down here? What's on the paper? What's on the papyrus? What's on the stone? And not looking at how that can come off of that page and live in the world. Jesus says, you're salt, you're light, and this is how you fulfill the law and not abolish it. But he does give a bit of a warning right at the very end there about entering the kingdom of heaven. Unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you're not getting in. And sometimes we interpret that as meaning we're not getting into heaven. That's not what he said. Sometimes we interpret that as meaning we're not going to get an earthly reward for being his disciples. That's not what he said. He said, be salt, be light. You are salt, you are light, because that's what the world needs. Now, I had an opportunity this week to read a couple of essays about this. I listened to a podcast, and one of a podcast quoted an author named Sally McFague. And in her book, Life Abundant, Rethinking Theology and Economy for a Planet in Peril, she wrote, if God is absent from this world, it's because we are. And I think this is getting at what Jesus meant about being salt and being light. And if your saltiness loses its flavor, it's not worth anything. So I'm going to read to you some excerpts from a couple of essays that I read this week from the Christian Century. One is from a man named Brian Moss, and he is a bishop of the Nebraska Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church. And he wrote this in January 2017. 6 years ago. By grace, God chooses us. That said, it's clear that it's a lot more complicated for us to actually be salt and light than it was for us to become salt and light. Being salt and light involves giving ourselves away completely. True salt, salt that has not lost its taste, disappears into food to make the food tastier. Jesus' disciples transformed the world by disappearing in service. Life in a world this salted is full of flavor and savory. Likewise, light that is not bound by obstructions dissipates over miles like the ripples of self-giving service. Life in a world so enlightened is liberated from bondage to darkness. And this is going to get a little pointed, so this is a warning for you all. He goes on to say, the rub, of course, is that we humans, even we so-called faithful ones, are hesitant to give ourselves away quite so fully, to dissolve or dissipate quite so completely. We like to hold back a little or cluster with like-minded people so that we can complement one another on our saltiness and brightness without the effort of salting or lightening anything. Here in the United States, at least, we who call ourselves Christian have for some time tended to cluster our salt and concentrate our light to the exclusions of others and to the benefit of none. Trading humility for hubris, we have salted our culture well nigh to death with notions utterly foreign to the Sermon on the Mount. We speak of Christian values, Christian policies, Christian economics, Christian candidates, Christian plumbers, Christian internet plans, and even Christian hookup sites. We lament being persecuted Christians, overlooked Christians, insulted and mocked Christians, even Christians deprived of the phrase, Merry Christmas. Too good for this world. In this essay, Brian Moss illustrates how salt has lost its flavor and has become useless and valueless. In another essay by a man named James Sledge, who is the pastor of Falls Church Presbyterian Church, blogging at Spiritual Hiccups, he says this: in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus refers to us as salt and light. The obvious idea is that we impact the world we live in. And given that the world does not yet look all that much like the kingdom of God, Jesus fully expected that our impacting the world around us would cause problems, that we would be persecuted like the prophets of old. It's worth noting that those prophets generally were not persecuted for what they believed. They were persecuted by fellow members of their faith, fellow worshipers of God. And they were persecuted because they insisted that being God's people demanded they live differently than the way they are now. The prophets insisted they could not claim to be God's people while exploiting the poor, worrying about their personal fortunes more than God's command, and so on and so on. James Sledge goes on to say, I regularly hear the term introverted to describe church congregations. Often this happens in the context of people talking about not doing evangelism. He goes on to say, but I think the issue is much larger, going well beyond not telling others about our faith. Our introversion thinks that we can be good Christians without being noticed. It thinks we can blend in with the prevailing culture, acting no different from anyone else beyond believing in Jesus and going to worship on occasion. He goes on to say, I sometimes think that the demise of Christendom, of a culture that enforces some basic Christian practices, is a huge gift to the church Jesus envisions. When the culture stopped being overtly Christian, being a good citizen could no longer be synonymous with being a follower of Jesus. This has been bad news for the institutional church, hurting attendance on Sunday and shrinking the collections and offering plates. But it forces us to redefine ourselves. If we aren't simply good citizens who believe a few peculiar things, then who are we? Jesus says, we are salt. We are light. Ultimately, to be salt, to be light, to be used by God as God intends for the purpose of God's creation, is to dissolve and dissipate in the process of flavoring and enlightening. There's no partial dissolution, no limited dissipation. When you are salt and you flavor. When you are light, you illuminate and you shine out, all of you. To be salt and to be light is to live out that old hymn that says, I surrender all. There remains only this hitch: the realization that this dissolving and this dissipating is best known by another name: dying. Dying to control, dying to security, dying to self. That is the shortest route, and really the only route to resurrection, to life after death. Why would we be afraid of that? Why would we hold on to our saltiness, our light capacity? Give it out, because there's always more. Jesus has blown up a balloon, whole bunch of balloons, and has set them like a balloon collection right there on the table, ready for a celebration. Jesus says to us, you are already blessed with gifts for blessing the world. So go and bless. Spice it up. Shine a light on it. And here are some instructions for how best to do just that. Filling out God's commands, God's promise of presence with us. You're blessed when you mourn, because brothers and sisters will come and show you how much you are valued and will comfort you. You are blessed when you refuse to participate in playground games over life and death issues. You will show how unserious the pretenders of, you will show the unserious pretenders how serious peace is. You are blessed when you will not be satisfied until God's justice is borne out in the world. You will not settle for, that's the way it's always been, so why bother? You are blessed when you live your life so closely dissolved into Jesus' life that people will look at you funny. Some will reject you, but others will wonder why you're like that. And then you might find yourself being a person who fishes for people loved so much by God. So friends, get out your salt shakers, find your flashlights, go be salt and light, and help fulfill the law of God in this world, to love God with everything you have, and to love your neighbor as yourself. Thanks be to God for the gift of our risen Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, who died and was raised to set us free. Amen.